Hello to the Women in Public Policy Program's seminar series on fairness and meritocracy at work. Very happy to have you back. My name is Iris Bohnet. I'm on the faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I co-direct the Women in Public Policy Program. This semester, we're featuring a number of academic speakers who focus on the challenges that undermine fairness and meritocracy, and maybe even more importantly, on potential interventions that help us overcome some of these barriers to true equal opportunity for everyone. Today, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome back Professor Anne Boring, who is going to talk to us about discrimination, rejection, and job search. Anne is an associate professor of economics at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Anne was a fellow at the Women in Public Policy Program just a few years ago, which is why we're happy to have her back. Anne's research focuses on the labor market, specifically on the development and evolution of career aspirations, human resource strategies, and public policies that help us level the playing field. Today, Anne is going to specifically focus on how job seekers respond to a particular hiring practice that is gaining in importance around the world. Anne will present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and she welcomes your questions during the talk. We have the Q&A function for that, so please type in your question and I will read it aloud. But Anne will also stop her lecture in between and specifically invite us to ask questions as they come up. And with that, Anne, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Iris. I'm really happy to participate in this great seminar series. I'm going to present to you some of my research with co-authors Katie Kaufman, who's at Harvard Business School, also Dylan Glover at INSEAD, and Maria Jose Gonzalez Fuentes, who's a PhD student at ENS Lyon and Cergy. In this project, we're interested on the effect of blind hiring policies. You probably already know what blind hiring policies are. They became very popular in recent years, and especially since a paper by Claudia Golden and Cecilia Rouse, that's about 25 years old now, but that showed that blinding applications can reduce discrimination at the hiring stage. Their research more specifically looked at what happens in auditions for an orchestra. They had data from the US, and they found that when orchestras throughout the US started putting a curtain between members of a jury that were selecting and or auditioning or selecting for players for orchestras, they tended to discriminate less. So having these blind application processes helped more women be part of orchestras. And they had quite striking results, so like 25% increase in the chances of women being hired. And one of the main reasons was that it helped women pass the first stage of the hiring process to be able to audition behind this curtain. Since then, there's been some other papers that looked at the impact of blind hiring processes, but more on the discrimination side. So the extent to which recruiters are discriminating less thanks to the blind. A lot of these papers are based in Europe, and a lot of the experimental work has to do with ethnic and racial diversity. So most of the existing evidence on blind processes focuses on the demand side, so really on the recruiter side. What we are interested in doing in this research is to look at the impact of blind hiring processes on job candidates, so those who are supplying their work and who are applying for jobs. And we're going to ask two different questions. These are our two main research questions in this project. The first one is, does blinding a hiring process increase the share of counter-stereotypical candidates who apply? In our setting, this is going to be women and older candidates. And does a rejection based on a blind hiring process impact future application behaviors? So this is, we think a major addition of this research project is to not only look at the first decision to apply or not to a job, but also do people get more or less discouraged if they get rejected on a blind versus a non-blind application process. This connects to the recent literature on the impacts of anticipated discrimination. So the extent to which people behave in a certain way because they anticipate future discrimination. So some candidates not applying to some jobs if they think that the organization that they're applying to might be discriminating them down the road. You can think also of women not applying for certain fields of higher education if they anticipate that in some fields of higher education they might be discriminated more against than in other fields. So this is kind of where our paper comes in. And of course, this paper also relates to Iris's work with Thierry Shilesi, and kind of what do we know about what types of interventions work to make the workplace more fair, and that's the whole theme of this seminar series. All right, so our contribution is to think about who are the candidates who might prefer blind versus non-blind applications. And what we are thinking throughout this project is that candidates may prefer blind applications to avoid discrimination. This is kind of the most straightforward mechanism that is related to these blind application processes. So perhaps to make it a little bit more concrete, in the real world, when we're not just looking at orchestras, blind application processes would be any type of process where individual demographic characteristics are taken out of the initial process, so the initial application, such that recruiters don't have information, for instance, on a person's name or a person's gender, a person's ethnic background. You can also think of a blind application process by removing someone's postal address so that you can't infer socioeconomic background, for instance. So those would be blind application processes. The kind of the main logic is to think of an application reflecting only a person's skills and ability to perform a task, and trying to strip away from the application process any type of individual characteristic that might generate a bias for recruiters. Saying recruiters, and this can also include AI recruiters, and maybe this is something we can talk about towards the end of the presentation. We're also thinking that some people, of course, may prefer non-blind applications. And those who may prefer non-blind applications are going to be candidates who who might expect recruiter discrimination in favor of their type. If you think recruiters might actually like people from your group, you might prefer to apply with a non-blind application where you can show these elements that might be favorable for your applications. We also, throughout this research, we also came across some people who told us that, maybe they actually preferred non-blind applications because they want to be able to screen prejudiced employers. So if the applications are blinded, but at the end of the day, recruiters, once the interview comes around, are going to discriminate against a candidate may prefer, first of all, avoiding this negative experience of this interaction with the recruiter, but also they might prefer just not wasting their own time if they don't have any real chance of being hired by a discriminatory recruiter. Some people also said, I'm proud of my identity. I don't see why I should be hiding elements of my identity. So kind of in economic terms, we'd say that they receive utility that directly from revealing their identity. And then a more subtle mechanism that we were thinking about relates to a paper by Hedges and co-authors who explain that people who tend to be more overconfident when they don't get what they expect tend to blame it more often on prejudice. So typically, someone who would not be hired in the context of a quota policy, for instance, they would argue that the reason why they did not get a promotion is because of the quota, although maybe actually the reason why they did not get the promotion was just because they were the lesser qualified candidates. So here, if you apply in a non-blind context, so in a context where people can see your identity, then you actually open the door for potential discrimination. And this is something that might actually be useful because it's a kind of a way of protecting one's ego, of being able to blame something you don't get on discrimination rather than on lower skills. So we have these two different mechanisms, and kind of the purpose of our research is to try to figure out what is the net effect of blinding applications. We're going to design an online experiment where we're going to have two sides of a market. So we're going to have participants either act as recruiters or as job candidates for a job opportunity that I'm going to describe in a bit. And we're going to be able to observe the extent of discrimination, but also how job candidates in this online setting react to a blind versus a non-blind application. So which one do they prefer? And when they get rejected for a given job opportunity, how does that impact their willingness to apply again for a similar job in a second round of applications? That's a general setup. We conducted this experiment online. This is with US participants on a platform that's called Prolific. So Prolific participants tend to, they answer surveys. Generally, they're experimental surveys. They generally know this has to do with research. Of course, we told them this is for research purposes. And we told these online participants that they will act as either a recruiter or as a candidate on this market. I do want to stress these are not real recruiters and these are not real candidates, but we incentivize the responses of our online subjects in such a way that they would respond in a realistic way, or at least in a truthful way. All right, let me start diving into the setup. I will first of all start talking about what we found on the candidate side, and then I'm going to talk more about what we found on the recruiter side. And I will open up to, I'm going to start on the candidate side and then open up a little bit for questions in case you have any questions about the experimental design that we're creating here or about our research question hypothesis. All right. So we have or unless we already have some questions. No, all right. So for our candidates, we ask our candidates online to build a resume, and we tell them that there are some recruiters who are prolific participants like them who are recruiting candidates for a job opportunity that is based on coding skills. So it's a task that is stereotypically male and young. And I'm going to show you this is also a task where male candidates and younger candidates do tend to perform better than female candidates and older candidates. This generally has to do also with educational background. More men go into STEM than women go into STEM fields. So this partly explains why also men perform better on this coding task. Recruiters make hiring decisions based on candidate resumes. They have clear incentives to hire candidates whom they think would be performing better on this task that requires coding skills. So recruiters earn more by hiring candidates with better coding skills. The hired candidates, they receive more money, so they are hired in that way, although they will not be doing any extra work past the online experiments that they're currently doing for us. Then the candidates build, so they get this information, and then they build this resume for a job opportunity. All of the different combinations of resumes had already been evaluated by recruiters. So these are very standardized resumes in order to be able to get to elicit recruiters' willingness to hire these different profiles. The candidates have the following profiles. So the age is either you're under 45 or 45 or older. Gender, you can say either man, woman, non-binary, or prefer to self-describe. Educational attainments. So this is the highest level of educational attainments by the candidates. So either high school, bachelor's degree, advanced degree. What's your favorite subject between humanities, social sciences, and STEM? And we have the candidates do a coding skills test that has 10 questions. And we're going to say, we're going to do a random draw of 2 of their answers on 2 of these questions out of 10. And the score you got on those 2 questions is going to be shown to recruiters. The reason why we do that is that we did not want to have a perfect measure of someone's ability, and this mimics what often happens in many labor markets, where resumes have yields noisy information about a person's actual skills, unless the recruiter has them do their own technical skills. Okay, this is one of the questions that we ask them. So it's just to show you, it's just an example, but it's just so that you get an idea that this is really clearly a coding job for which people are being hired. We do not tell their candidates what their score is, but we do ask them to provide us a guess of their score out of 10. And through this guess, then we can compare what number they gave us with their actual performance. And this gives us an idea of how overconfident a candidate is. So someone who tends to believe that they perform better or much better than they actually did, this would be a more overconfident person. And someone who's underconfident is someone who tends to underperform relative to their true score. And so they have these 10 questions. We draw 2 at random, and their score is the one that's going to be shown to recruiters. This is what a resume looks like. This is for a blind resume. So on the blind resume, we don't show any information about gender or age. We only show information about educational attainment, your favorite subjects, and the sample performance of the technical test. So we say, here is your resume for this job opportunity. It includes the following personal information you provided. So a bachelor's degree, social science as a favorite subject, and then your score on 2 questions picked at random. We don't tell them what score was shown. We just say it's your score on 2 questions picked at random. And then this is the non-blind resume. Here we provide information relative to age and gender. For gender, we kept only man or woman. Our sample size was just too small otherwise for other groups. But we have here these 5 different characteristics. So this is someone who's a man who's under 45, who has a bachelor's degree in humanities, and their score on 2 questions picked at random. All right, so these are people's resumes. We show them one of the 2 resumes, and we ask them, so this is using what is called an incentivized multiple price list, but basically what this means is that we ask them, how willing are you to apply for the job opportunity with this resume? And we ask them for a first resume. So this could be either their blind or their non-blind resume. And then we update the resume. Then we ask them, what's your willingness to apply? That's W2A. So what's your willingness to apply with a second resume? And that tells us the extent to which our job candidates prefer applying with one resume versus another. Here, prefer applying with one resume versus another actually means they think their chances of being hired are greater with one of the 2 resumes. All right, maybe this is a good time to pause just for the beginning of the setup.
I actually have a quick question and clarifying question. So willingness to apply, is that on a scale from 1 to 100 that I'm going to indicate that, or how am I indicating this?
Yes, so this is in cents. So we tell them, yeah. You can either apply for a given position, and if you get hired, you're going to get a certain wage, versus you get $1 for sure. So yeah, and then you go. We have the price list. I took it out of the presentation just because it's not obvious for non-experimentalists. But then for experimentalists, so you really have kind of this trade-off, and the main idea is to see kind of what is the outside option of the candidates when they're applying with one resume.
I see. Yeah, so that's the incentive compatible part here, right?
Yeah.
That as a candidate, I really have to think about, do I want to have a sure $1 or $10, whatever it is, or do I think that this is, I really have a chance to get $12 or $15?
Exactly. Yeah. I think like the most a candidate could get was $10.50 by applying, whereas like, otherwise the sure option was $1. So there's so yeah, but it really depended on the extent to which recruiters, the extent to which they thought recruiters would be willing to hire them. Because of course, if a recruiter rejected their application, then they got zero if they had chosen to apply.
Yep. No, thank you. Any other questions for clarification on kind of the design or the setup? Please use the Q&A function and type it in. We don't have any questions at this point, Anne, so I think that you can continue. Thank you.
All right. So we elicit this willingness to apply. We're going to standardize everything in order to make the different price lists comparable. But before I show you the results, I'm going to present to you the kind of the whole experimental design. So we measure their beliefs about both resumes. So we ask them questions about, for instance, which resume did they think they would have a better chance of being hired, etc. And then we picked one resume at random. And on that resume, we ask specific questions, which are on the bottom part here of this slide.
And I'm going to just interrupt you for a second because
yes.
Paula has a question about the previous slide, so maybe we can just address it while we're at it, specifically about the beliefs. So is this how you measure this beliefs about discrimination on the demand side, right? That's what Paula's question is. Yes, that's exactly what you're trying to get at there.
Yeah, exactly. So we measure in different ways. So in a sense, their willingness to apply is a belief about the extent to which they think they have good chances of getting hired. We also asked them some questions about, so which resume do you think you'd be more likely to be hired with? So that's a more direct question than with the price list. We also asked some questions about what they think is the overall hiring rate for blind and non-blind resumes. Do they think, like in general, people have more chances with a blind versus a non-blind resume? And then we picked one resume on which we asked more specific questions. So we asked them, what do they think is the probability of being hired with this resume? How qualified do they think they are relative to other candidates? How disappointed would they be if they would be rejected? What sample performance they thought was shown on the resume? And then an important question for us is the following. We give them 100 points, and we ask them to distribute those 100 points on the 5 resume characteristics, asking them, imagine a recruiter decided to hire you with this resume. To what extent would each of the different characteristics contribute to the recruiter's decision to hire you? And then we ask the same question about, imagine the recruiter decided not to hire you, and then we ask them to distribute those 100 points. So let's say that you think, I'm a woman, and maybe I would assume that recruiters have do statistical discrimination in favor of men for this type of task. I might say that, maybe 20 points would be on gender, for instance. We ask that for people who either see their non-blind resume, so here we have the 5 characteristics, and then we ask the same question for people who have for whom we're looking at their blind resume, and in that case, they have to distribute the 100 points on education, favorite subject, and sample performance. Once we do that, We then reject all applications. We checked, first of all, that there was always, for every type of resume, there were options where recruiters were rejecting. There was at least one recruiter that rejected the resume. So this is truthful information in the sense that we tell them, before you continue, we wanted to provide you with some feedback. This feedback is based on how one recruiter evaluated your resume. Importantly, it is independent from the choices you submitted in the previous list, so this does not impact the actual incentives that they had, or their incentive pay. And we tell them this recruiter saw this resume. So here it's a blind resume with educational attainment, favorite subject, and the sample performance. And given the choice they had, the recruiter chose not to hire you. So everyone's going to get the same message based on whatever resume was picked on the previous rounds of questions. And then we ask them to re-answer all pre-rejection questions. So for instance, we say, so now that you have this decision, to what extent do you think, that you have to redistribute those 100 points on the different questions, on the different items? Okay, so once we're there, we go back to asking them their willingness to apply, this time following rejection. So were candidates more discouraged from applying again if they got rejected on a blind resume? Or are they more discouraged from applying again if they got rejected on a non-blind resume? So this is their revision of their willingness to apply with a rejected resume. And then we ask them with the other resume, now their willingness to apply again. And this gives us a within candidate design, both before rejection and post-rejection. So we know that if their preferences have shifted due to the rejection and due to the precise resume on which they got rejected. And then we do a final set of questions that's kind of more about people's overall experiences with the labor market and what do they do. There we ask them more direct questions about what do they think about blind hiring practices. About our candidates, so we collect data from 4,000 participants on Prolific. We stratify on age and gender, so that means we have groups of equal dimensions for men under 45, men 45 or older, etc. And we applied our pre-specified sample restrictions. One of the sample restrictions that was important was if people were spending enough time on the price list to comprehend the instructions. That's eliminated about 25% of our samples. But so we're sure that the ones that remained that were selected were those that actually understood our instructions. So this is kind of our quality check on the online survey experiments. Our final survey, our final sample includes about 2,500 candidates. All right, let me present to you the results, unless there's any question on the design.
I have one quick question, and there is also another question that just came in. But so when I'm told that somebody rejected my application, I know that my next, if I decide to reapply, will be sent to another random person. So basically, yes. I'm only encountering, so to speak, two randomly selected recruiters.
Yes.
In a way. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Indeed. So it's kind of meant to mimic what would be on a real labor market. You're a job seeker. You did not get you applied for a job. You didn't get it. Now you're applying for a new job, and it's going to be a new recruiter. So you might think, well, maybe I was unlucky with if I applied non-blind. Maybe I was unlucky with my first recruiter. Who maybe discriminated against me, but then this new recruiter, maybe this person doesn't discriminate, for instance.
Yeah, get it. So Paula, you have another question. I'm not sure whether this is an empirical or a theoretical question. I think it might be an empirical question, and maybe Anne will tell us the answer, but I'm going to read it to you, Anne. Empirical. Oh, Paula, it is an empirical question. Okay, I think then maybe we'll wait until we get to the results. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, this is a distribution of test scores by gender. So this is just kind of to frame things. So it is true that on average, men tend to perform better than women on the test score. The test had 10 questions. On average, women got correct 3.85, men 4.44. And you see kind of, this is going to be the same color code when I talk about gender. Lighter green, that's for men. Darker green is for women. And you kind of have the same types of distributions when you're looking at age differences. Older candidates tend to, they're the darker orange, they tend to perform worse on average than the younger candidates. So recruiters that apply statistical discrimination, they might discriminate in favor of younger men, given that these underlying distributions show that men and younger candidates on average tend to perform better. So first, the initial willingness to apply, and now we can answer these questions, are counter-stereotypical candidates. So again, here this would be older women candidates. Are they less willing to apply with a non-blind or a blind application? I'm showing you the results here in standardized scores, but this is the willingness to apply, and kind of what you're looking at is the direction. Are you above the 0 bar here? So this would be kind of more positive. We're standardizing across all price lists. So it's kind of to show that the initial applications, they tend to generate higher willingnesses to apply in general than what we're going to have post-rejection. But now we can compare men and women, and then below 45 candidates with the older folks. And what we find is that women apply significantly less than men under both type of applications. So they apply less than men in the non-blind application. Can you see my arrow when I'm, or maybe not? All right, so on the left-hand side, you have the non-blind, yeah, okay. You have the non-blind applications, and here you see that women's willingness to apply is below men's. And same thing on the right-hand side with blind applications. And then I'm going to look at afterwards, the relative demand for blind versus non-blind. So this is just kind of like looking at, in general, women apply less than men. And we have similar results for older candidates as well. And this is partly driven, we have I'll leave my comment for later. We have similar candidates, similar results for older candidates. What's interesting is when we start looking also at the willingness to apply by test score. And the darker green here, this is for men. Diamonds are for blind applications, and then the circles, this is for non-blind applications. And what you see is that the willingness to apply of both men and women is higher for better performers, which makes sense because they have better scores. They think there's a higher chance of them being hired. There's the score shown to recruiters is going to be higher. But what's interesting is that for men, there's no difference between blind versus non-blind applications, but you start seeing a difference in the willingness to apply for top-performing women candidates, and more specifically, women with the higher performing women tends to have a higher willingness to apply with the blind application process compared to a non-blind application process. So kind of for the top performers here, the slope is flatter for non-blind applications for women compared to the blind applications for women. This leads us.
Could we spend a moment on that previous? I mean, there's so much happening here, and it's so interesting. Yes. So I want to give people a chance to kind of just glance at this and understand, but also ask a question. And I'm going to ask a question first, just an observation. Is it correct that, women have to be almost perfect, a very, very high, right? I mean, that first gradient, I don't know, anyone can see my cursor. I see my cursor, but I'm looking at the, highest scoring women exactly versus then. And then it goes down very steeply and then it becomes relatively flat. Then it doesn't matter anymore so much. But women have very high, a high threshold in a way.
Yes. So one thing that is interesting that I didn't mention is kind of like for average or lower performing candidates, men's willingness to apply is always greater than women's.
Yes.
And I'm going to show you that there's also some interesting dynamics going on there in terms of the blind versus non-blind post-rejection. But so there is kind of like this, higher willingness to apply in general for men. We do look at differences in overconfidence, but also like risk-taking attitudes. And this is partly explained by the fact that men tend to are less risk-averse than women.
Oh,
But that's not the only thing. But it's not the only thing that's going on.
I figured you would get there. Yeah, but
Yeah.
not the only thing.
Yes. And then here so this kind of reflects lower confidence by women or lower risk taking. But it also reflects the fact that they anticipate that they might have greater chances of being discriminated against in a non-blind setting. And this is actually accurate. So I'm going to show you the recruiter results later on, but the better performing female candidates, they have a lower chance of being recruited. So that's where most of the discrimination actually takes place against them. So there is this kind of this correct anticipation to some extent. I'm going to show you, at least it's correct directionally. I'm going to show you I'm going to compare the difference between perceived discrimination versus the actual discrimination. And actually women tend to overestimate the amount of discrimination that they face. But here their initial willingness to apply already partly reflects that.
Thank you. We have no other questions.
Okay. Now we can kind of compare, like, do people prefer blind versus non-blind? So this is our demand for blind applications versus non-blind applications. So although women tend to apply less, when they do apply, they prefer applying with a blind application rather than a non-blind. And as I showed earlier, this is also kind of driven by these higher ability women who, when they do apply, they really prefer applying with a blind application. I think for organizations, that's already super interesting to know, right? So if you want to attract the better female candidates, you have a better chance of them applying to your job if they think that the process is fair. And in this case, they have a good chance of thinking that the process is going to be fair if it's a blind hiring process. So women have greater relative demands for blinding than men, but we don't find any significant age differences in relative demand for blinding. So it's actually more gender that's driving this greater demand for blinding. An interesting point that we find is that also our individuals, they tend to expect, so this is pre-rejection, but and it's going to be confirmed post-rejection, but they already expect less disappointment from a blind rejection. So there's kind of this idea that it's viewed as being a fairer process than a non-blind hiring process. And I think that's also interesting for organizations and recruiters. If we kind of divide this demand for blinding versus non-blind by how productive our candidates are, so like the lower performing, those are the ones who have a score from 0 to 5. Their demand for blinding is, I mean, it's positive for women and for 45 plus, but it's really greater for the higher productivity candidates. And what's interesting is that also for male higher productive candidates, they also have somewhat of a higher demand for blind applications. It's not as strong as women, but it's also there. So I think for many organizations, when they're thinking about what type of process they should implement, they think like who would agree or disagree, who would like this process or not. And kind of our results suggest that actually even higher performing men, they're kind of okay with having this blind hiring processes, at least initially. Then we ask questions about their expected gender discrimination. So this is like the distribution of points. I'm going to walk you through this graph a little bit. So what we have here is that we looked at the difference between, we said, imagine a recruiter would not hire you versus imagine a recruiter did hire you. And you had the 100 points that you could distribute on gender. And a positive number, and the more the positive number is, the more the candidate puts weight on the reason why I would not be hired is because of my gender. And then the negative number, it goes for people who actually think that gender has a higher weight for decisions to hire them. So basically, what we would call in Europe like positive discrimination, that would be the negative points. And then negative discrimination, so you think your gender plays against you in the hiring process, those are the positive numbers. And it's also kind of interesting to see that it's not like, women think that it's negative, like everyone agrees that, or women think that gender plays necessarily against them. You do have like 24% of women who actually think that gender can play in their favor. And this could be women who might think that actually recruiters might prefer diversity or might prefer to hire women. And we find that 35% of men expect positive net gender discrimination. More women do expect net negative gender discrimination, but there's also 22% of men who think that, in a non-blind hiring process, actually recruiters are going to discriminate against them. So there's also this diversity that we thought was interesting to quantify. The effects are stronger on age discrimination, and in terms of the expected negative net age discrimination, people who are 45 plus, they really tend to think that there's negative discrimination against them. And then for those who are below 45, it's kind of, one third. And we had an open-ended section at the end, and a lot of the 45 plus kind of really mentioned that actually age discrimination is really something that they hadn't necessarily expected, and something that they were very much experiencing on the labor market. And I mean, age of gender also comes out, but I think age is sometimes understudied compared to gender discrimination. But here there was kind of these strong effects in terms of actually the experiences of age discrimination were seemed quite vivid. So once we relate those expectations of discrimination to people's demand for blind applications, it's kind of it makes sense, but it shows in the data that those who expect negative net gender discrimination, they have a positive demand for blind versus non-blind. So they have a preference for blind application processes versus non-blind application processes. Is there any question at this stage?
Hold on. I need to move this over. Yeah. So somebody asked the following question. I'm just going to read it to you. I'm curious about if there were other identity markers besides gender, particularly race, ethnicity, national origin, or sexual orientation, that influenced some of the mindsets around blinding applications and willingness to reapply.
Yes, probably so. We kind of had to pick dimensions also just for statistical power. But I think this would be interesting to kind of replicate. I think one of the things we see also in our recruiter data, and also here is kind of like, in a sense, we have stronger demands for blind applications from women, but we see also strong dynamics regarding expected discrimination based on age. And yes, I think for other characteristics. So one of the issues is kind of what's going to show on a resume. So typically, like if you do correspondence studies to test for recruiter discrimination about sexual orientation, then kind of what would be the marker on a resume would be, are you part of an organization that defends LGBTQ plus rights, right? So something that's kind of very specific. The length of your CV, the number of years of your experience, to some extent, shows something about age. Gender, often by the name, you can infer gender. So that's also something that we added. We could definitely have done also race and ethnicity. That would also kind of show up in like a name more directly.
And theoretically, right, it could be due to the reasons for the discrimination. I mean, one reason could be that I don't like Swiss applicants. It's taste-based discrimination. I'm saying this because I'm Swiss. I don't like Swiss applicants, and we would normally call this taste-based discrimination. It has nothing to do with my beliefs about the person's performance. But Anne is kind of, I think, focusing a bit more on the second type of discrimination, which is which we call statistical discrimination in economics, which has something to do with my beliefs about your future performance. Now, probably there's no clean, probably it's always a little bit both. But I'm just, if you asked me to predict, I would always ask, do people have a theory in their
Yeah,
minds, whether it's accurate or not, but a theory in their minds about how these different demographic groups or identities might perform.
right.
I'm just saying this to the questioner. Maybe that's a good way for you to think about, would we expect the same or would we expect something different?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think also on these online settings, people tend to pay a little bit more attention in the way that they discriminate. So people will discriminate a little bit more based on statistical discrimination. If they have taste-based discrimination, it tends to appear less in these types of settings. That's my kind of experience of doing online survey experiments related to discrimination.
And can I read one more question to you that just
Yeah,
came in?
absolutely.
I'm wondering whether you have examined the interaction between gender and age in your analysis. It
Yes.
seems that older women may experience a form of double marginalization in the job search process. Have you explored this intersection?
Yes, so we did, and indeed, actually, gender is the main driver of the willingness to apply, but there is some intersectionality that does appear. I'm going to show you also some evidence on the recruiter side that also shows kind of how intersectionality works on the discrimination side. But indeed, they do tend to reinforce themselves, to reinforce each other. Sorry, and kind of the group that's a little bit more discriminated against are the older women on this market.
Thank you. I think we'll let you finish your presentation because I see we
Okay,
have about 15 minutes left.
perfect. All right. So now candidates are going to get rejected, and these are our main results. So we find that the average willingness to apply falls. So by 0.25 standard deviations, but it tends to fall. So, and this kind of also reflects what happens in labor markets when job candidates get rejected. They tend to be discouraged. And then if you look at job applications over time, of course, there's a selection effect of people who are still unemployed over time, but people do tend to become discouraged the more rejected they are, or the more their applications are rejected. We do find a difference by application type. So we find that the willingness to apply falls by 40% more after a blind rejection than a non-blind. So kind of initially, women are going to prefer to apply in a blind versus non-blind. But once they get rejected, and this is true for women, but it's true also in general, but those who get rejected with a blind, their willingness to apply, they get discouraged even more, kind of. So their willingness to apply drops more. So initially, the blinding helps with the supply of women, but after rejection, it's not as clear what the actual net effects are. And this is one of the main results of our experiment. We find that blind rejections lead to larger decreases in beliefs about own qualifications and about the believed likelihood of being hired. So it's kind of like, well, if I don't get hired with a blind application, that really means my chances are not good at being hired at all. Whereas if I don't get hired with non-blind, well, maybe just I got unlucky with a recruiter that discriminates against me, but maybe a new recruiter would be okay with hiring me. That being said, and this is, you could also view that as a positive of the blind rejections. The blind rejections are seen as less disappointing to participants, and they are seen as significantly more fair. So I think kind of the whole also purpose of your work, Iris, and then the seminar series, kind of making work fair. And this is the blind application processes do seem to go in that direction. We find that women's willingness to apply falls by twice as much after a blind rejection than a non-blind rejection. And older individuals' willingness to apply falls by 50% more. So it's not to the same extent as women, but it's still directionally the same after a blind rejection than a non-blind rejection. Let me show you some of the graphs. So this is first here we can take a look at the right-hand side. So this is the willingness to apply. This is the demand for blind applications after rejection on a blind resume. So after rejection on a blind resume, you see that, well, women's willingness to apply is, women's demand for blinding is still positive. But an interesting thing that shows up is that for men now, if they got rejected on a blind resume, now they tend to have a higher demand for non-blind applications. So somehow they think that actually, well, if they did not get hired on a blind, well, maybe they're going to have a better chance of being hired with a non-blind. That's not something that we find with women. So here we find that after a blind rejection, demand for blinding modestly decreases overall. So you see that the willingness to apply with the blind after a rejection on blind resume. The demand for blind applications is smaller, and it tends the candidates who tend to who expect to benefit from stereotypes, and here again it's more gender that's driving than age. Now they have this higher demand for non-blind applications. Now those who got rejected on a non-blind resume, here the demand for blind application is positive for everyone, but it's greater for women compared to men. So these are the demand for blind applications, right? So I'm not showing you the levels of the willingness to apply, it's just they drop overall. That's what I showed that's what I told you in the previous slide. But this is still to show that even despite the fact that the willingness to apply drops for women after a rejection, there is still a higher demand for blind applications. This is where it can get a bit confusing, so I'm happy to do a bit of a pause here.
I mean, it sounds like, and let me try to rephrase to see whether we understood this correctly. It feels as if this was a fair rejection, right? I mean, I learned something about my relative standing, and I learned that my performance probably wasn't strong enough or isn't strong enough in this market. And, you know, it's also not terrible in the sense that maybe it's an informative signal. I shouldn't waste my time. And I take it as an informative signal. So I trust the signal. It was fair, and I'm going to do something else. So I don't even know from a gender equity point of view of how to think about this. I mean, I obviously love the fairness of the process overall, but I also think it might be, maybe it actually is a good thing for candidates to get informative feedback, right? To kind of know, well, maybe that's not the kind of area that I should apply to because my chances are really small. And that's the blind process kind of provides that. Yes.
So I agree. We've had this discussion also with my co-authors of, at the end of the day, is this a good thing or not? I mean, the question is kind of, was it because you were unlucky that you did not get the job? So maybe are you inferring too much information from the rejection? Or actually, perhaps in a non-blind setting, you're not inferring enough information, right? So actually your skills just don't fit. But you're saying it's, you know, all of these other things that are explaining why you did not get hired. And I think that's a very interesting question. And I think it's a real difficulty for people who are looking for jobs, is just getting a good idea of, you know, where do my skills fit in well in a good environment. Yes, so it could go either way. I think just kind of people's overall feelings of fairness, that is already kind of a positive, clear benefit in terms of, if we really want to think in terms of the well-being of the subjects in our experiments. Regarding the real labor market, it could be also something that's positive as well. Here let me move on to the recruiters, because then we can also kind of get an idea of also how well do people, you know, infer information. All right, let me move forward. Let me skip these two slides. I have 5 minutes left, or 6 minutes left. So I'm gonna just give you some. This is really just descriptive. So this is we asked them at the end, you know, in general, how much do you worry about discriminated against in the job market because of your gender? That's on the left-hand side, or because of your age. And so you see that women in general, they tend to anticipate more, or they worry more about being discriminated against, whether it's because of their gender or because of their age. You see here that older candidates, it's close to 80% who worry about being discriminated against in the job market because of their age. So this kind of also goes towards the what we were talking about earlier about the intersectionality. And then we had some questions that were, like really asking people about their preferences regarding blinding applications or not. So here we ask them, including my demographic characteristics, do you think it will help you get an interview, allow you to screen discriminating employers, show a part of my identity that I'm proud of, creates a doubt if selected for my competence or my identity. So this is kind of the issue often with quota policies that comes up. If a woman gets promoted, then there's this competence signaling problem that it's not necessarily clear that she got promoted because she was competent versus the quota. Or the final one is about supporting DEI policies in the workplace. And I think kind of like the main thing that comes out here is that whether you look at younger, older, men, women, people's preferences are quite diverse or heterogeneous. And there's even amongst women, some do prefer showing their characteristics. But we wanted to relate how people answered these questions with their actual demand for blinding. And those who are worried about gender discrimination or who are worried about age discrimination, they have a significant higher demand for blinding applications. Those who think that showing their characteristics, so they're a minority, they will help me get an interview, the minority of men and women, they have a higher demand for non-blind applications, which again makes sense because I think that really that helps them in the labor market. Those who are proud about their elements of their identity, they also significantly have a higher demand for non-blind applications. And then those who answered yes on the other questions, there's no difference for demand for blinding versus non-blind. All right. Okay. And then, well, actually, let me skip this slide. Okay, let me move on to the recruiters. I just go pretty quickly. So here are the recruiters. They view the technical test. They provide their beliefs of performance on the technical test for all types. So they tell us, like, do they think men or women tend to perform better? And then they evaluate 5 resumes, and they either evaluate 5 blind or 5 non-blind resumes. Right, here you have the distribution of the probability, the hiring probabilities by candidate gender. Each dot represents one resume type. And kind of here what you find is that these 4 dots that are up here, these correspond to candidates who tend to have better signals, like STEM candidates who have 2 out of 2 on their tests. And for those candidates, you see that there's a gap between the probability for men of being hired versus women of being hired. So, for instance, here, like the best signal men, they have about 70% chance of being hired versus about a 60% chance of being hired for female. The same characteristics, just the only thing you change is females. What we look at is there any type of in-group bias by recruiter gender for candidates who have the same identity as they do. And if anything, what we find is that the benefit that men have comes from older men who tends to have a higher probability of hiring older men as well. So there's a higher in-group bias for older men. Older women, on the other hand, they have they kind of discount. It's not statistically significant, but it's negative. So they tend to be the ones who would they have who, if anything, discriminate against women of their own group. So this partly explains why we have this gap between the hiring probabilities between men and women. And perhaps let me finish with this figure here because I think we only have 2 minutes left. So here I teased you a bit about the real versus the perceived levels of discrimination. What you have on panel A is the extent to which blinding your applications will help you be hired in percentage points. So you see that blinding will help women, older candidates, older female candidates in being hired by increasing their probability. In percentage points, it's relatively small, but it is significant. What female candidates think about their expected chances of being hired in a blind hiring process is significantly higher. So they perceive a greater benefit of blinding, and not only that, but they overestimate the returns to blinding applications. And then after rejection, this drops substantially. There's this question of like how well people, how much information people or correct information people are really inferring from anticipated discrimination versus actual discrimination, both before and after rejection. And you see there's quite a lot of noise there. All right. So I'll conclude there, perhaps just with one final conclusion about the overall effects of blinding. We find that initially blinding reduces age and gender gaps in the pool of hired candidates, and this is partly through reduced discrimination, and especially of older talented women, but it's also partly through the increased applications. The post-rejection patterns, they look a bit different because women tend to apply less, and there's more discouragement following rejections, and especially following rejection on blind applications. All right, it's a lot of information, but I hope you got the gist of it.
We definitely get. Thank you so much, Anne, for this very insightful presentation and for also looking at how anonymizing resumes affects the applicants, actually. So with that, thank you so much. The downside of the webinar is you can't see us clap, but I know many people are. Thank you for joining us.